If you ask me whether I still wake up screaming in the middle of the night, the answer is yes. In my dreams, I don't hear the waves slapping against the hull, nor do I hear the nauseating scream of twisting metal. In my dreams, there is only one sound, a monotone, continuous, suffocating hum, like a mechanical heartbeat. People talk about the Pacific War, and they always wax poetic about the dive bombers at Midway or the Marine flamethrowers on Iwo Jima. But in the spring of 1945, in that gray expanse of sea north of Okinawa, the shape of war had changed completely. It was no longer just man against man. It was the collision of vacuum tubes and fanatical faith, a duel between an iron curtain built of radio waves and flesh and blood turned into divine wind. My name is Thomas Miller. In 1945, I was a lieutenant, junior grade, on the USS Laffey, DD-724, serving as a radar watch officer in the Combat Information Center, CIC. This is the story of the tin can sailors. It is also the story of those unsung revolutionary technologies, radar, the CIC, and the VT fuse, and how they pulled us back from the edge of hell. To understand the terror we faced at Okinawa in 1945, you first have to understand our ship and the brain hidden deep within her belly. I boarded the USS Laffey in 1944. She was an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, a brand new warship. Compared to the earlier Fletcher class, she packed more firepower, equipped with 3 twin-mount 5-inch guns, plus a frightening number of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns. From the outside, she looked like a porcupine bristling with quills. But for an officer like me, the Laffey's true power lay not in her guns, but in her antennas. If you stood on the bridge and looked up, you'd see mesh objects rotating on the mast. That was our soul. The SC-2 air search radar, looking like a giant bed spring, was responsible for long-range detection. The SG surface search radar, that spinning little dish, allowed us to spot periscopes on the sea surface in the pitch black of night. However, the place where these chaotic electronic signals were translated into killing orders was the CIC, the Combat Information Center. Early in the war, like at Guadalcanal, destroyers didn't have a real CIC. Back then, the captain commanded from the bridge with binoculars, a radar man shouted from a corner, and information was fragmented. But by 1945, if you walked into the Laffey's CIC, you'd think you had stumbled into a scene from a science fiction novel. That room was located below deck, windowless, and permanently lit by red battle lamps to preserve our night vision. The air was perpetually thick with the smell of ozone, stale coffee, and the nervous sweat of 24 men. It was like the inside of a giant clock, precise and oppressive. As a CIC officer, my station was behind a large, transparent plotting board. When you put on your headset, you cut off all connection with the outside world. You couldn't see the blue sky or white clouds. You couldn't see your shipmates' faces. You faced a circular radar screen, the Plan Position Indicator, PPI. On it, a bright scan line swept clockwise like a windshield wiper. With every sweep, it left a phosphorescent afterglow on the dark green background. We called those irregular blips bogies, unidentified aircraft, or bandits, confirmed enemy. It's not just watching a screen, Tom, my mentor and the head of CIC, Lieutenant Bill Lumsden, once told me. It's an electronic game. You have to convert space, time, speed, and fuel into a vector in your head, and then tell the fighters in the sky where to go to kill. This was one of our revolutionary technologies, fighter direction. Before the Battle of Okinawa, the U.S. Navy had established an incredibly complex defense system. We, the radar Picket ships, were deployed at the outermost perimeter of the fleet, perhaps 50 to 70 miles from the main body. We hung out there alone, like solitary sentries. We had 2 missions. First, use radar to detect Japanese planes as early as possible. Second, use the Fighter Director Officer, FDO, on board to directly command the Combat Air Patrol, CAP, via radio to intercept them. At the time, this was inconceivable. You have to understand, Japanese pilots were still looking for targets using magnetic compasses and their own eyes, while we had already woven an invisible electronic web over the ocean. When the Japanese formations were still threading through the clouds, we not only knew where they were, we knew how many there were and at what altitude. The Laffey's CIC was like a stock exchange. Talkers wearing massive headsets and breastplate transmitters constantly repeated data from the radar men, lookouts, and the bridge. Bearing 0-3-0, range 50 miles, heavy returns, possible large raid. Altitude 12,000, speed 280. IF, identification friend or foe, negative, confirmed bandits. And in the center of this clamor, I would mark the enemy's track on the plotting board with a grease pencil, calculate the intercept point, and then tell our F-4U Corsairs or F-6F Hellcats in the sky via radio. Wasp Squadron, this is Laffey. Vector 330, climb to Angels 12, prepare to engage. This sense of control beyond visual range once gave us the illusion that we were invincible. We could look down on the battlefield like God, moving planes around like chess pieces, until that word became frequent on the radio, Kamikaze. March 1945, we were heading to Okinawa. When the fleet assembled at Ulithi Atoll, the sight was breathtaking. If you looked down from the air, the entire ocean was covered in gray steel. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers, transports. It was the largest armada in human history. We called it the Big Blue Blanket. But in the wardroom, the atmosphere was exceptionally grim. "They're crazy," Gunnery Officer Arnold said, chewing on a cigar, his brow furrowed. "I saw that kind of attack in the Philippines. They aren't coming to drop bombs. They are the bombs, man and plane, smashing directly into us." We had all heard about Leyte Gulf, and we had heard of the special attack units. At first, we thought it was just the desperate act of individuals, a dying struggle. But intelligence showed this had become the national policy of the Japanese Empire. They were hoarding thousands of planes, Zeros, Vals, even old biplane trainers, preparing to die with us at Okinawa. For us destroyer sailors, this tactic brought the deadliest threat. To protect the massive landing fleet and the carrier groups, the Navy devised the radar picket station plan. They drew 16 circles around Okinawa, especially to the north. Each circle was a radar picket station. 1 or 2 destroyers, plus a few support landing craft, would be deployed to each station. We were to sit alone at the very edge of the fleet's air defense circle, acting as bait and alarms. "This is basically slicing us up to feed the sharks," I muttered when we got the operation plan. We were assigned to Radar Picket Station 1, RP-1. This wasn't just a code name, it was a death warrant. RP-1 was located directly north of Okinawa, facing the Japanese home island of Kyushu. This was the highway for Japanese planes flying south to attack the American fleet. Any Japanese plane wanting to attack the American carriers would see us first. The Laffey, floating lonely on the sea. Bill Lumsden patted my shoulder, his face pale under the red battle lights. "That's why we need the CIC, Tom. If we can't guide the fighters to them before they see us, we'll have to rely on our own guns." Speaking of guns, that was our second revolutionary line of defense, the VT fuse, variable time, proximity fuse. This was top secret. Previous anti-aircraft shells relied on either timed fuses, set to explode after a certain number of seconds, or contact fuses, direct impact. This required extreme calculation precision. Against high-speed diving aircraft, the hit rate was pitifully low, but the VT fuse was different. Inside the nose of every shell was a miniature radio transceiver. Think of it as a tiny radar. When the shell flew within about 70 feet of a plane, the radio waves reflected back, triggered the fuse, and the shell detonated automatically. This meant we didn't need a direct hit. Just getting the shell near the plane was enough for the shrapnel to shred a fragile Zero into pieces. It was a miracle that only American industrial power could produce. stuffing vacuum tubes into an artillery shell that had to withstand 20,000 Gs of acceleration upon firing. "We have the best radar, the best fuses, the best ship," Captain Becton told the crew over the 1MC before we sortied. "Let the bastards come." Even so, watching those young sailors wiping down the barrels of the 40mm Bofors on deck, I felt a chill. Technology is cold, but the people watching those blips in the CIC were flesh and blood. April 1st, April Fool's Day, and also L-Day, Love Day. U.S. forces landed on Okinawa. The first few days were eerily quiet. We sat at Station RP-1, and the radar screen showed nothing but friendly aircraft. The ocean was intoxicatingly blue. If everyone hadn't been wearing life jackets and steel helmets, you'd think it was a vacation cruise. But it was only the calm before the storm. On April 6th, the Japanese launched a massive special attack operation codenamed Kikusui No. 1, Floating Chrysanthemum. That afternoon, I was on watch in the CIC. Suddenly, the voice of Jim, the SC-2 operator, cracked. "Sir, bearing 350, range 80 miles. Jesus, the screen is lighting up." I rushed to the PPI screen. On that green phosphor display, it was no longer scattered specks, but a dense mass of snow, like a blizzard about to sweep in. That wasn't interference. That was planes. Hundreds of them. "Count?" I asked, my throat dry. "Impossible to count. At least 100, maybe more. They're pouring in from Kyushu." The air in the CIC solidified instantly. This was the moment we had been waiting for, and the moment we feared most. "Sound general quarters. All hands man your battle stations." The klaxon screamed throughout the ship. I put on my headset and connected to the CAP channel overhead. Circling above us were 4 F-6F Hellcats from the carrier Yorktown. "Eagle 1, this is Laffey, bearing 350, range 70, large raid. This is not a drill. Repeat, not a drill. It's a feast out there." "Copy, Laffey. Tally-ho." My God, they're like a swarm of flies. The pilot's voice held a tremor, but mostly adrenaline. The next few hours were a weave of pure chaos and order. Inside the CIC, we couldn't see the sky outside. We perceived the war only through radar blips and shouting on the radio. "Eagle 1 splashed 2 vals. Eagle 3 is chasing a jack. Bearing 010 leakers. Range 20 miles, closing fast." This is the fate of a radar picket ship. Our fighters intercepted as many as they could, but there were too many enemies. There would always be leakers. And those leakers, unable to find the carriers, would vent their rage on the nearest target, us. Starboard side, 2 bandits diving. The lookout on the bridge screamed. The ship vibrated violently. That was our 5-inch main battery opening fire, followed by the distinctive thump, thump, thump rhythm of the Bofors, and finally, the ripping canvas sound of the Oerlikons. I gripped the handrail in the CIC, eyes glued to the radar screen. Before, I would have been anxious about not seeing the battle, but now I knew my battlefield was right here. "Fire control radar locked," I shouted. "Locked on, Mk-12 radar tracking." Using data from the fire control radar, the main guns could engage miles out. The VT fuses began to do their work. Although I couldn't see the picture, I could imagine the black puffs of smoke exploding near the enemy planes, sending steel flying. "Splash 1. A cheer came over the sound-powered phone. The battle that day lasted a long time. We survived the floating chrysanthemum offensive. When we stepped out of the CIC onto the deck for air, the smell of gunpowder was thick. The setting sun dyed the sea blood red, but I felt no relief, because that night we received news from other picket stations. The USS Bush DD-529 had been sunk just south of RP-1. She was another destroyer with excellent radar. She was hit by 3 kamikazes in succession and nearly sliced in half. Then the USS Colhoun, which went to her rescue, was also sunk. When the news reached the wardroom, everyone drank their coffee in silence. No one spoke. The Bush was a good ship. Her CIC was as advanced as ours. She had VT fuses. She had fighter cover. But she still sank. The Japanese had discovered a terrifying loophole. As long as there were enough planes, and as long as they didn't just dive from high altitude but flew low against the waves to hide in the radar's blind spots or attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, they could breach our electronic barrier. Radar is not omnipotent. It cannot distinguish whether the pilots are insane. They aren't fighting a war, the navigator said, staring into the black liquid in his cup. They are making a sacrifice, and we are the altar. That night, lying in my bunk, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the blips I saw on the radar screen today. Every blip that disappeared meant a plane crashing or one of our ships being hit. It was a brutal mathematical game. Our radar detection range, rate of fire, and number of fighters, minus the number of enemy planes and their level of madness. As long as the result wasn't a negative number, we lived. However, for the Laffey, the real test was yet to come. We didn't know it then, but in 2 weeks, we were about to write the most insane, incredible chapter of survival in U.S. Navy history. April 15th. We received new orders. Due to the loss of other destroyers, the Laffey was ordered to station RP-1, that most dangerous isolated northern sentry post. Lumsden and I exchanged a look in the CIC. It was the look of men before an execution. "Check all the tubes, Tom," he said. "Tomorrow, we need this machine to spin faster than ever." "Aye, sir." I looked at that ghostly green screen, still sweeping round and round. It was calm, objective, devoid of emotion. It showed the truth, whether that truth was survival or destruction. I remembered the circus my father took me to, where there was a tamer who put his head inside a lion's mouth. Now, we were that tamer, and we were sailing this 8,500-ton steel warship right down the throat of the furious beast that was the Japanese Empire. This was Okinawa, 1945. Here, technology was our shield, but courage was our heart. And our heart was about to be hammered on the anvil. April 16th, 1945. Monday. In history books, it's just a date, but in my memory, it was the end of the world. At 0800, I took over the watch in the CIC. The sea state at RP-1 was surprisingly good, calm, and unruffled. If you didn't look at the radar screen, it looked like the peaceful Caribbean. But staring at that circular PPI scope, my heartbeat inexplicably began to accelerate. "Tom, looks like the Japanese woke up early today," the radar man I relieved whispered. At 0825, the first wave of signals appeared. This wasn't like the sporadic probing of the past. The blips on the screen started as a faint green mist on the northern edge, but within seconds, that mist began to split and spread. "Radar contact, bearing 020, range 85 miles, large raid." My palms were instantly slick with sweat, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "CIC to bridge. Large number of bogies detected. Repeat, large number. Count." Jesus, count is impossible to estimate. At least 50. This is what we later called a saturation attack. The Japanese had learned their lesson. They no longer sent planes in one by one to die, but swarmed out of the hive. Their tactical intent was clear: swamp our radar processing capacity, exhaust our anti-aircraft ammunition, and break through our fighter defense line. "Fighter Director Officer, FDO, this is CIC, I shouted into the mic. "Vector, all cap over here, all of them." Covering us above RP-1 at the time were a few F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs from the carrier Yorktown. Our FDO, a Texan who usually loved to crack jokes, was now sweating profusely, screaming into the radio, trying to command a three-dimensional aerial dogfight on a two-dimensional radar screen. "Vector 3-6-0, Angels 10, intercept now." But I could see a despairing scene on the radar screen. Although the blips representing our fighters bravely charged into the enemy formation, splashing target after target, There were simply too many enemy blips. They were like sand slipping through fingers, uncontrollably leaking toward the center, toward the Laffey. This was the limit of radar technology. Our SC-2 radar could tell me enemies were coming, could tell me where they were, but it couldn't help me wipe them from the sky. When the number of enemy planes exceeded the capacity of the intercept channels, high-tech electronic warfare devolved into the most primal survival instinct. At 0830, the first Japanese plane broke through the fighter defense. Visual contact, bandits diving. A scream came from the bridge. The nightmare began. I must explain the feeling inside the CIC at that moment. We were below deck. We couldn't hear the wind or the waves. The first loud noise we heard was the sound of our own 5-inch main guns firing. It was a low, soul-shaking roar. The ship shook violently, dust raining down from the overhead. "Fire control radar locked," I shouted. "Locked. MK-37 director tracking. Range 5,000 yards, 4,000 yards." At this moment, the VT fuse demonstrated its terrifying efficiency. Amidst the interference on the radar screen, I could even imagine the scene outside. 5-inch shells detonating automatically 20 yards from the enemy planes. Steel rain instantly shredding a fragile Valdive bomber. Splash 1. Splash 2. For the first few minutes, we felt invincible. This was the victory of technology. We had radar guidance. We had proximity fuses. We were a floating steel fortress. But the Japanese didn't care about technology. They had madness. At 0835, the situation took a sharp turn for the worse. "Alert! Multi-axis attack! The bastards are coming from everywhere!" The radar screen had turned into a chaotic flurry of green snow. The enemy planes were no longer entering from a single direction. They split up, diving simultaneously from the bow, stern, port, and starboard. Our fire control radar could only lock onto one target at a time, and now there were a dozen planes circling us, looking for blind spots. Suddenly, a massive, metal-tearing crash rang out, 10 times louder than the main guns firing. The entire CIC jumped violently. My body was thrown hard against the plotting board. My coffee cup flew across the room, and the red battle lights flickered, and half of them died. "We're hit." That was the first successful kamikaze. A Val, though turned into a sieve by our 20mm guns, still crashed into our ship with its bomb. Then came the second, the third. The air in the CIC instantly became sweltering. The ventilation ducts no longer blew cool air, but began to backdraft a thick, acrid smell, the scent of burning paint, exploding ordnance, and charred flesh. "Is the radar still working?" I yelled in the darkness. "SC-2 antenna is unresponsive. SG radar picture is fuzzy," the radar man cried out. "Sir, we're blind. We're blind." This is the moment when technology is most fragile, when shockwaves shatter delicate vacuum tubes, when explosions sever coaxial cables, when your proudest 1,000-mile eye turns into a pile of scrap metal. What do you have left? I don't remember who shouted it first. Switch to secondary comms. Use sound-powered phones to the gun mounts. Without radar, we went back to the Napoleonic era. We stopped staring at screens. We relied on human eyes, on shouting, on muscle memory. Just then, another massive explosion. This time, it felt like the entire ship was lifted by a giant hand and slammed back onto the water. That was 2 kamikazes crashing almost simultaneously into the aft 5-inch gun mount, Mount 53. I knew I had to leave the CIC. The radar was dead. As a radar officer, if I didn't go outside to help fight fires or save the wounded, I was just a waste of space. The moment I pushed open the watertight door and climbed onto the deck, the sight before me was something I would never forget. If the CIC was a cool green hell, the deck was a scorching red one. The Laffey was burning. The stern was blown beyond recognition, rolling with thick smoke, flames reaching dozens of feet high. Debris was everywhere. Plane wreckage, twisted steel plates, scattered shell casings. This was the famous Duel of April 16th. In a short 80 minutes, the Laffey suffered at least 22 separate attacks. Even in your wildest nightmares, you cannot imagine such density. I saw a Judy, Yokosuka D4Y dive bomber diving from the stern. Our aft main guns were destroyed, a sea of fire. But right in that fire, I saw a few surviving gunners. They didn't run. They were manually operating the remaining 20mm Oerlikons. No radar guidance, no power drive. They braced the stocks against their shoulders, correcting their aim with tracers, firing wildly at the diving reaper. "Kill him! Kill him!" someone screamed. The plane was hit, its wings snapped, and it tumbled into the sea, the splash drenching the deck. But before we could cheer, another plane rushed in. This was no longer naval warfare. This was hand-to-hand combat on the high seas. The distance was so close I could see the white hachimaki headbands on the Japanese pilots, see the twisted expressions on their faces. This is what our proud, revolutionary technology looked like after it failed. When the VT Fuzes didn't have time to arm, when the fire control computers couldn't keep up with the angular velocity, all that was left were the bones of American sailors. On the bridge, Captain Becton was commanding this battered ship in sharp turns. Every turn was an attempt to dodge a fatal impact, but the rudder jammed and the ship listed. Port side, torpedo bomber. A Kate, B-5N torpedo bomber, was flying just above the waves. It was a textbook attack run. If that torpedo hit, we were done. In that split second, a miracle happened. Not a radar miracle, but a human one. It was our forward main guns, Mount 51 and 52. Although the fire control radar still worked at this point-blank range, the gun captain chose visual aim, direct fire. The 5-inch guns depressed to an almost flat trajectory. These were meant to kill ships. Now they were used to swat a plane. The shells hit the water surface, throwing up a massive wall of water. The torpedo bomber slammed into the water wall like a bug hitting a fly swatter and instantly disintegrated. I stumbled toward a 40mm Bofors mount to help pass ammunition. It was running with blood. The loader had fallen. The man next to him immediately took his place. The gunner was hit by shrapnel. Another man dragged him aside and stomped on the firing pedal. "Don't stop, don't stop. As long as it's shooting, we're alive." That was the phrase I heard most during that battle. By 0940, this ship no longer looked like a ship. We had lost our stern, lost our radar, lost our comms, lost our rudder. The superstructure was riddled with holes, looking like a giant honeycomb. Every breath inhaled hot soot. But I saw incredible things. Communications Officer Frank Manson, standing by the flag bag next to the bridge, surrounded by fire, was still using signal flags to signal the support fighters in the sky. And those surviving radar men from the CIC, they ran out and joined the damage control parties. Holding fire hoses, they rushed toward the magazine, which held hundreds of tons of explosives, to fight the fire, even though the seawater was already lapping at their ankles. At this point, American fighters finally arrived in force. Dozens of Corsairs and Hellcats pounced on the remaining Japanese planes like angry wasps. I saw a Japanese plane, chased by one of our F-4Us, trying to make a final struggle to crash into our bridge. Just as it was about to hit, that F-4U risked everything, diving right into our own anti-aircraft fire envelope and literally sliced off the Kamikaze's tail with its prop. The enemy plane grazed our mast and crashed into the sea. The massive shockwave knocked me to the deck, but I got up. Everyone got up. When the last enemy plane was shot down or flew away, silence suddenly fell. That silence was more deafening than the explosions. I held onto the railing, gasping for air. My uniform was torn, my face covered in soot and grease. I looked around. The Laffey was still floating. She was belching black smoke, listing heavily to port, her stern almost underwater, her deck piled with plane wreckage and the bodies of shipmates. But this 8,500-ton piece of steel, this tin can packed with the most advanced electronics of the time, remained stubbornly afloat after sustaining direct hits from 6 suicide planes and 4 bombs. It defied physics. It defied naval engineering. Captain Becton's voice came over the emergency megaphone, hoarse but incredibly firm. All departments report damage. We are going to sail this ship back. In that moment, I thought of our days in the CIC, thought of those flickering green lights, thought of those cold vector calculations. Technology gave us the first strike. Radar let us see the enemy. VT fuses helped us thin the herd. But in the end, when the vacuum tubes shattered and the screens went dark, what held up this iron curtain was no longer those revolutionary machines, but men. It was the sailors who stood at their guns, knowing they would die. It was the damage control teams turning valves in a sea of fire. On these waters of Okinawa, on this insane morning, technology and will forged a bloody pact. We paid a terrible price, but we held station RP-1. We did not sink. The minutes following the end of the battle were the longest silence of my life. No roar of flak, no screaming engines, not even the hum of the radar cooling fans that used to annoy me day and night. All that remained was the sound of waves lapping against the hull and a metallic groan from deep within the ship, like a dying beast. I stood on the ravaged deck, still clutching the headset with its severed cord. My legs were shaking as a delayed wave of terror washed over me. CIC report. CIC report. I muttered subconsciously to the air, but no one answered. Captain Becton's order broke the dead silence. Damage control, full check. Corpsman, to the fantail. Move the wounded to the wardroom. The order turned us back into clockwork machines. As an officer, I had to swallow my fear. I stumbled toward the stern, where Mount 53 used to be. Now, only a massive smoking crater remained. The sight made my stomach churn. Even after serving in the Pacific for so long, I had never seen such carnage. The deck was a slurry of seawater, firefighting foam, hydraulic fluid, and blood. That dark red, viscous liquid moved beneath my feet with the rolling of the ship. But this was not just destruction, it was a testament to a miracle. The ship had been turned into a sieve. The rudder was jammed 26 degrees left, the aft mast was snapped, and radar antennas hung like withered vines. The stern sat deep in the water. If you stood on the fantail, the ocean was almost at your feet. Yet, she floated. "Sir, give us a hand," a young petty officer shouted. I ran over to help lift a stretcher. Lying on it was a gunner from the aft 20mm mounts. His face was covered in soot, but I recognized him. Just yesterday, he was joking with me about having nothing but Spam to eat. "Did we get him, sir?" he asked weakly, his eyes swollen to slits. "We got him, son," I said, holding his grease-stained hand. "You blew him to pieces." He tried to grin, but quickly passed out. That afternoon, we were no longer radar operators or gunners. We were porters and cleaners. We searched the wreckage for the remains of our shipmates, lining them up neatly on the intact forward deck. An American flag was found. Though torn by shrapnel, its colors were still vivid. As we draped the flag over those young bodies, I realized that every green blip that had vanished from my radar screen had turned into a heavy white body bag here. This is the cost of technology. We spot the enemy miles away with electronic eyes, destroy them with proximity fuses, but when that electronic barrier is breached, the final bill is paid by these men in their early 20s. By evening, the tugboat finally arrived. Watching that sturdy ocean tug ask for our tow line, I felt a mix of deep humiliation and relief. Our proud porcupine, equipped with the most advanced tech, now had to be towed from the battlefield like a cripple. But looking back at the shattered bridge, seeing Captain Becton still at his command post, a surge of indescribable pride rose in my heart. The Japanese wanted to sink us. They sent 22 planes, used their best kamikaze pilots, used their so-called Bushido spirit. But we were still here. This tin can from Bath Iron Works was still floating on the water. We were towed back to the anchorage at Karamaretto. It was the logistics base for the Okinawa campaign and a massive floating repair yard, or more accurately, a floating graveyard. As we entered the anchorage, I was stunned. I thought only we had been through hell, but looking around, the place was filled with scarred destroyers, mine layers, and escorts. Some ships had their bridges sheared off, some had gaping holes in their sides, some were still smoldering. This was the cost of the radar picket line. The electronic wall we built to protect the carriers and landing fleet was mortared with the hulls of destroyers. As we passed other ships, sailors on their decks stopped their work. There were no cheers, no whistles. They just stood silently and saluted us. They could see the wounds on our hull. 4 bomb hits, 6 suicide plane crashes. The fact that this ship returned was a physical fallacy. During our days at the anchorage, I finally had the chance to step back into the CIC. It was dead silent now. Emergency power lit the room dimly. I walked to my station. The giant plotting board was shattered, grease pencils scattered on the floor. I picked up a shard. It still bore a line I had drawn, the death track of some kamikaze. Bill Lumsden walked in, his arm in a sling. "It's over, Tom." He handed me a cup of lukewarm coffee. "The radar can't be fixed," I said, looking at the charred consoles. "All the magnetrons are shattered." "Doesn't need fixing," Bill smiled bitterly. "We got orders. We're going home. They can't fix this damage here. We have to go to Seattle." Home. The word sounded so distant. But before going home, we had one last mission. On a clear morning at Karamaretto, we held a burial at sea on the deck. 32 body bags. For a destroyer, that meant we lost 1/10 of our brothers. Another 71 were wounded. The chaplain read the prayers, the sea breeze rustling the pages of his Bible. I couldn't see the complex electronic instruments, couldn't see the cold vacuum tubes. I only saw white shapes sliding one by one into the sea. When the last body sank into the blue Pacific, the bugler played taps. The mournful notes echoed over the anchorage. I thought of that kamikaze pilot, the one whose tail was sliced off by our F-4U moments before impact. Was he a young man too? Did he also believe he was doing something great? That is war. We did math problems in the CIC. They burned their lives in the sky. When the two collided, all that was left was sorrow. The Laffey did not die. Like a stubborn phoenix, she dragged her broken body halfway across the Pacific, back to the U.S. West Coast. When we pulled into the port of Seattle, people looked at us as either heroes or monsters. The shipyard engineers shook their heads at our hull, saying the ship should have snapped in two long ago. But in the days that followed, as a CIC officer, I was summoned multiple times to Navy Department technical debriefings. The scientists with thick glasses and the generals with stars on their shoulders wanted to know not just about our bravery, but about the data. "Lieutenant Miller, what was the operator reaction time when target density exceeded 10 per minute? What was the detonation rate of the VT fuses on low-altitude targets? Was the fighter direction radio channel congested?" I realized that the nightmare we experienced at Okinawa was being dismantled into data, becoming the cornerstone of the next generation of naval tactics. We were the prototype. We were validating a brand new concept of naval warfare with our lives. Fleet air defense. Before World War II, naval warfare was a gun duel within visual range. But at Okinawa, in our CIC, the embryo of modern naval warfare was born. We proved that through radar networks, centralized command, CIC, and automated weapons, VT fuses, a fleet could intercept enemies dozens of miles away. This was the ancestor of what would become the Aegis combat system. Years later, when I saw the first cruiser equipped with missiles and computerized tactical data systems, I smiled. That tidy, bright, air-conditioned modern combat center with giant screens was paradise. But that paradise was built on the foundation of the Laffey's sweltering, smoke-filled, fear-drenched CIC. Every line we drew with grease pencils on transparent plastic became an algorithm in a computer. Every bearing we shouted became a bit stream in a data link. In August 1945, we heard the news of the Japanese surrender while in the shipyard. 2 atomic bombs ended the war. Everyone cheered, but I felt an inexplicable sense of loss. The atomic bomb was another technological extreme. It made individual courage seem even more insignificant. It is now 1995. I am standing at Patriots Point, South Carolina. That is my ship, the Laffey. She wasn't scrapped. After surviving the baptism of the Korean War and the Cold War, she retired with honor to become a museum ship. She sits quietly at the dock, her gray paint gleaming in the sun. I am an old man now. I need a cane to walk. But I insist on climbing that steep ladder one more time, walking into that familiar yet strange place, the CIC. The smells of the past are gone. No ozone, no sweat, no smell of fear. Only the faint scent of old oil and mustiness. Those radar screens, SC2, SG, they are dark. The plotting board is clean. I close my eyes, and for a split second, time rewinds 50 years. I hear it. I hear the hum of the cooling fans. I hear the rapid breathing over the sound-powered phones. I hear Bill Lumsden shouting, "Bearing 350, large raid." I hear the roar of the 5-inch guns. I hear the scream of tearing metal. And I see that green light, that scan line rotating in the darkness. It was our eyes, our lifeline. A group of visiting schoolchildren pours in, breaking my reverie. They excitedly touch the switches, asking innocent questions. "Grandpa, is this screen for playing video games?" A little boy in a baseball cap asks me. I look at him and smile. I want to tell him that yes, it was a game, only the stakes were hundreds of lives and the fate of nations. "No, son," I say softly. "It's a mirror." "A mirror?" He looks at me, confused. "Yes. If you look closely, you can see not only the planes far away, but also your own fear and your courage." I'm not sure he understood. He quickly ran off to play with a sound-powered phone nearby. I walk out of the CIC onto the deck. The sea breeze blows through my white hair. I look to the north, toward that empty ocean. So-called revolutionary technology, whether it was the radar and proximity fuses of yesterday, or the stealth fighters and cruise missiles of today, are ultimately just tools. They can make killing more efficient, make war more distant, but they can never replace the core, the human being. It is man who decides when to press the button. It is man who decides whether to run or stand firm in the face of hopelessness. In Okinawa in 1945, in that sea of death known as the radar picket station, we built an electronic barrier. That barrier was made of more than just radio waves. It was forged by the Laffey, the Bush, the Manert El Abele, by those destroyers called tin cans, and the flesh and blood of the sailors aboard them. The Japanese Kamikaze thought technology was cold, thought we could be crushed by fanatical faith, but they were wrong. When the radar failed, we became the radar. When the fire control severed, we became the computer. When the hull shattered, our will became the keel. This is the story of the Laffey. This is not just a memoir about technology. It is a testament to how the human soul stubbornly survives in the crack between steel and electronics.